look. There. You know you can see her.
I can't!
Admit it! She's there. You know you can see her.
I can't!
But look, she's there.
She's there, that's right!
Stop it, miss. But you can see her. You must.
On today's episode of Alt Cinema, I'm going to be doing a public service announcement for all of you. At least for those of you who are still in school, I'm going to give you the subject of a term paper that you can either use in your English Lit class or in your Film History and Aesthetics class. What we're going to examine today is Jack Clayton's 1961 adaptation of Henry James's immortal short story, The Turn of the Screw. Let's talk about some of the other attached people involved with this. First and most popular, at least in terms of name recognition today, is Truman Capote, who, this was way before he did In Cold Blood. But it was still right at that period when the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's had come out. So he was a big name on the New York and LA circuits in terms of being someone whose work was very highly appreciated. He'd done some additional dialogue on Beat the Devil and a number of other pictures. Jack Clayton was one of those directors who was known as being more or less a good, solid workman. But a couple of years earlier, he had had an enormous success with his adaptation of Room at the Top, which was one of the early kitchen sink dramas of the British New Wave. And so he had a lot of power in order to get something like this made. And finally, let's look at Deborah Kerr. Deborah Kerr was one of those stars who was not only a great actress, but she was also a great beauty. And combining those two elements made her a favorite on both sides of the Atlantic. You can look at her in a movie like Black Narcissus, where she plays an insane nun, or you can look at her in some of the other British movies like The Life and Times of Colonel Blimp, and see her real ability to make something work. Look at her in a romance like An Affair to Remember, and we see just what a versatile actress she was. So it seemed at first for this to be a daring choice, but perhaps not, given the fact that she was certainly an actress who was never afraid of a good old-fashioned challenge. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this work, and really you should be because you should have read it in high school, it's a typical Henry James story, meaning that it's wildly ambiguous, meaning that you can look at the corkscrew English syntax in it and not be able to figure out what's going on, even though you have to read an additional 90 pages of it by Monday morning. And overall, it's one of those things where you get the feeling that if it didn't exist, English teachers would have created it just to give lots of homework assignments. The story concerns a young governess who ends up going to a mysterious large house where she is going to be taking care of two children in that house as their governess. And during the course of the time she is there, suddenly it seems as if the house is haunted by the former valet and the former governess, who were both very, very fond of the children and maybe perhaps too fond. And now they seem to have come back as ghosts. Things reach ahead, the ghosts make appearances, the little girl of the couple goes almost stark raving mad, and at the very end of it, the governess left alone with the little boy ends up being, in one way or another, the agent of his death. Again, this story has been subject to a lot of interpretations, so let's go through each of the interpretations and talk about how the film addressed them, because, believe it or not, they managed to include almost all of them. There are some that were not included, and we will get to those in the end. The first and most common interpretation of it, especially now, given that the story is almost 120 years old to begin with, and is from that period of high English lit that is now rather disdained academically, is that the ghosts are real. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to say that this is in fact the correct interpretation, being that James himself always referred to the story as a potboiler, pure and simple. And for some reason, critics and English teachers have never been able to accept that. So many interpretations have come out around it. Nevertheless, there's a lot of evidence in the film to suggest that this is indeed the case. First of all, we see the ghosts themselves. They appear, they seem to haunt, and the influence on the children from the time they make their appearance is quite profound. It seems as if the governess slowly loses control of her charges the more the spirits seem to interfere. Part of the evidence that there really are ghosts is the scene when the governess sees Miss Jessel, the former governess, in the library, and Miss Jessel is crying. The governess goes over to the desk, and there's a teardrop on the desk. Now, this seems to be tilting the adaptation in favor of that particular interpretation that the ghosts are real. However, when we look at other scenes, we also see attempts to prove the other theories. So just because this seems to be tilting it one way doesn't mean that there won't be things that tilt it the other way. Around 1924 or so, the story had already achieved wide renown, probably because a lot of people were thrilled that it wasn't the Bostonians. And a new interpretation came out from Edna Kenter. And this was in an essay she wrote called The Ruminant James. And in this article, she posited for the first time, and perhaps it was even from her own feelings, that the governess herself is not necessarily a reliable narrator. And maybe the governess, in fact, is the culprit behind all of this. And while the essay got some attention, it wasn't until about 10 years later when Edmund Wilson, who had the benefit, if we're going to believe a lot of cultural theory, of being a male, and so therefore he wrote an article called The Ambiguity of Henry James. And in that he went all in on the whole idea that the governess is an unreliable narrator and that more likely than not, she's the one who haunted the house, that there were no ghosts, that all of this were hallucinations that were brought about by her own rather strict Christian upbringing, and now all of that is coming home to roost, and the children are in fact the victims of an insane woman. Now, this particular interpretation got really popular because, first of all, it removed the story from the realm of a ghost story and therefore allowed James to be elevated yet again and look like even more of a genius writer, and therefore much more easy to employ future English teachers. And there's a lot of evidence within the story that can back this up. First of all, she is a governess. Secondly, it is a story from her point of view, so obviously it's going to be very, very favorable toward her. And in fact, if we accept that the governess might indeed be insane, then how can we even trust the narrative that she gave? So, what James does, or what Truman Capote and Jack Clayton did in order to kind of make this theory work, is that the ghosts don't make their first appearance until the children are doing a hide-and-seek game. And during the course of their hide-and-seek game, the governess stumbles across a picture of Quint, the valet. From that moment on, he makes his appearance, but we have been tipped to the fact that Quint, in fact, it could be a figment of the governess's imagination, because now she has seen visual evidence of what he looked like. One of the big problems with this theory in terms of the book is that there comes a scene when the governess describes what Quint looked like, and the housekeeper immediately recognizes him. And this is a moment at which all of the people who go for the governess's insane theory get insane over, because it seems to be the one point which makes total hash of everything that they have come up with. And in fact, some of the explanations they have to cover this are very ingenious. For example, one of them says, oh, well, certainly there were other people at Bly, and so therefore the governess probably asked them, and they described Quint, or maybe she went into town, because it's not as if they were stuck in that house all by themselves, and maybe she asked someone in town, any number of things. Or even that she's so convincing it that the servant, being intimidated by the fact that this young creature has power over her, says yes to avoid being fired. Okay, every one of those is legitimate, but they're also extra-textual. In other words, they're not written about. So if we're going to be ingenious and start making up stuff, we could certainly come up with even better theories than that. The third theory is that the children are in fact evil.
What shall I say when my Lord comes a-calling? What shall I say when he knocks on my door? What shall I say when his feet enter softly, leaving the marks of his grave on my floor?
And again, we see plenty of evidence of the children being evil. What's an example of a piece of evidence that the children are evil? Well, just look at the way they are always giving rather sinister looks. Just look at the way they seem to be huddling with each other, giving secrets. This is practically lifted from the book, and every scene in the film that includes this particular part of the theory. And it's interesting to see, because when you see it visualized, the children really do come across as evil creatures, and so that particular theory is quite supported. The next official theory that was in heavy play before the movie was made is one that is not necessarily covered that thoroughly. And that is that the story is either an allegory of Christendom and the whole idea of there being a God who is absent and allowing the world to go nuts. We do kind of see this in the fact that the uncle at the very beginning pretty much tells Miss Giddens that he will not make an appearance, and that everything that happens in the house is going to be her responsibility. We do kind of see that played out because she's hesitant to write the uncle a letter when things start going all to hell. But that interpretation, as well as a fellow interpretation of it, which says that the story is an allegory of very, very strict Protestantism versus paganism. Yeah, okay, they're there, but that's really getting into twee territory. Now, let's look at some of the theories that have come about since the movie was made, and some of them actually do have play within the film. So let's approach that one first. The first of these theories is that, in fact, the governess is a pedophile, and that the governess has sexual designs on the kids, and the fact that they are alone in the house all by themselves with only an ignorant, and I'm saying ignorant in the literal sense because Mrs. Gross cannot read or write, that they're in the house with someone who has complete authority, and therefore the children are completely at the mercy of this governess. And we see that enacted in this when we see the way the governess is towards Miles. First of all, he makes what could be argued to be the first move when he insists on kissing her and gets a little bit too close.
Kiss me good night, Miss Giddens.
But it's reinforced near the end when we see the governess actually reach over and fully embrace Miles, and it's kind of a creepy bit. The second theory, which covered another weird point in the governess is insane story, is that, well, how many kids, just because someone is going insane around them, actually drops dead of terror?
You don't fool me. I know why you keep on and on. It's because you're afraid. You're afraid you might be mad. So you keep on and on, trying to make me admit something that isn't true. Trying to frighten me the way you frightened Flora. But I'm not Flora. I'm no baby. You think you can run to my uncle with a lot of lies. But he won't believe you. Not when I tell him what you are. A damned hussy. A damned dirty-minded hag. You never fooled us. We always knew.
And some of the English professors who have written about this say that if you read the text very carefully, you see that the governess was violent towards Miles. And we see that even though that was not a common theory at the time the movie was made, he does cover it. You do see the governess being very, very violent toward Miles. Maybe not to the point where we expect him to die, but certainly there's enough evidence when she knocks him over that he could have sustained other injuries. Now we come to the two theories that aren't covered at all in this version. The first of them is that Douglas is Miles. Now, okay, who's Douglas? In the original story that Henry James wrote, there's a prologue to the action, and during the prologue we see the author, presumably James, listening to ghost stories around the fireplace on Christmas Eve. And Douglas is this guy who has a manuscript that was written by his governess, who all of this stuff apparently happened to. And he brings the manuscript, and it's written in this beautiful hand. And Douglas clearly had an attraction to her, which kind of fits in with the pedophile theory. And as they read the story, it becomes clear that maybe the governess was writing this to Miles as, in a way, explicating her rather unsavory behavior towards him, and maybe the fact that they might have gone a little too far. Douglas is the same age as Miles was when he met with Miss Giddens. He too had come back from school unexpectedly, and he did have an attraction with her that even now, multiple years later and after her death, has caused him to hang on to her manuscript. This is actually one of my favorite theories about Turn of the Screw, and there was really no way to include it in the film without adding a whole prologue with people you will never see again. So I understand why it wasn't there, but it was interesting. Perhaps my favorite theory, and one that is really not covered at all in the film, although you could make some wild interpretations of the footage and make it fit, is that the housekeeper did it. That the housekeeper is the actual villainess of the piece, and that what this whole situation has been is her attempt to use someone who is an insignificant person who somehow got into power over her, is now in control of her, and yet she's weak-minded, and so the evil governess, Mrs. Gross, figures out a way to spook her out by maybe even enlisting the children to help out. And one of the further theories of this is that Mrs. Gross is actually the children's mother. And that's why she's so protective toward them, because after all, the Harley Street uncle never wants to come to the house. Why doesn't he want to come to the house? It's this big mansion. Why wouldn't he want to be there? And the story about how Miles and Flora became orphaned is convenient rather than believable. Apparently their parents got killed in India or something like that. And he never wanted the children. Doesn't that sound like the old excuse that was used really through the 1960s of a daughter going away to visit an aunt, and then while there discovering that there was a foundling child who needed a mother, and then the family deciding to adopt the child, and we all know what really happened there. So there is some reason to believe that there was some fooling around between upstairs and downstairs. After all, we saw that enacted more recently in Robert Altman's, what I consider to be his penultimate film, Gosford Park, where we see that what goes on downstairs is often very interrelated with what's going on upstairs. So there you go. I have now given you plenty of material to write your term paper. The film itself is well worth seeing. Overall, it's a perfect example of how to take a simple narrative and leave in ambiguous elements so that as a moviegoer, you do need to work a little bit to figure out what's really happening.
More than anything I love.